This video is brought to you by MUBI, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/yardsaid.
When it comes to teaching inner-city minorities, you don't need books and you don't need rules. All you need is a nice white lady.
The Hollywood savior was an expected and natural progression of the atypical Hollywood hero. John McClane is a far cry from John Keating on the surface, but when the common consensus on storytelling is that every story needs a hero, it's only natural that a story about teachers and the education system would find one character to pen heroic ambition and sainthood on. And it works because generally people love movies that make them feel good, movies that make them want to follow their dreams or be a positive influence. I fully intend on poking holes in and poking fun at some of the more questionable takes in the teacher-savior subgenre, so beloved by many, but I'd like to make it known that I typically enjoy the hell out of a feel-good teacher movie. School of Rock, Linklater's best film, I don't care what anyone says. Licorice, Little Pepino still makes me cry. And I'm even worse with the feel-good sports movie. For a person who does not watch and knows very little about sports, put a paint-by-numbers inspirational sports movie in front of me and you've given me a comfort movie for life. I've seen Coach Carter enough times to have not only the dialogue memorized, but every single needle drop to a T. And I still get emotional when Timo wants to rejoin the basketball team, but he owes Coach all these push-ups and suicides, and he doesn't do enough in time to be part of the team again. And like,
I'll do push-ups for him.
I'll do some. I'll run suicides too.
I do some too.
One person struggles, we all struggle. One player triumphs, we all triumph, right? Ah! I love it! So I won't act as if I don't get the appeal of these movies or like I don't have the faintest idea as to why Hollywood loves this trope so truly, madly, deeply. What I do intend to question is the framing devices used in these movies, the educators it chooses to highlight, its racial implications, the failure of nuance when these stories, many of which are based on reality, are put through the black and white filter of play it safe Hollywood, and the real life impact these films have on the already failing American education system.
This is my classroom. You don't like it, the door's to my left. Lady, why you be tripping like that? No, Jamal. You be tripping.
So where exactly did the save our students trope begin? If we look back far enough, it seems like a tale as old as time. Even prior to Blackboard Jungle, the film often credited with kickstarting the subgenre.
It's pronounced da-dee.
There was Bright Road. Bright Road was a 1953 film based on schoolteacher Mary Elizabeth Roman's short story, a piece of fiction loosely based on her experiences with teaching and published in a June 1951 edition of Ladies' Home Journal. The film adaptation starred legendary players Dorothy Dandridge and Harry Belafonte in their first of many on-screen collaborations.
Thank you, Mr. Williams.
That's all right, Miss Richards. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Williams.
What are we talking about? Chemistry. We're talking about chemistry, man.
Jane Richards is a young, novice school teacher, nervous about her first year of teaching. She has some difficulty with troubled student CT, but slowly gets through to him by being empathetic and patient. The movie's also about her burgeoning romance with the principal, Mr. Williams. Bright Road, along with being one of the first in this subgenre, is also only one of the very few, or maybe like two, films that exist about black women being teachers and being a positive influence on their students. But you know what to do with your pen by now. It wasn't until Blackboard Jungle in 1955 and later Up the Down Staircase that the scenario began to shift. With the real world beginning to have more desegregation, we got stories about white school teachers having to teach black and brown kids and not knowing how to control them, which in itself is already a bit... It's here in history that you can see the wheels of the Hollywood mind beginning to turn. The appeal, it seems, in making these movies isn't just to churn out inspirational fodder. It's to utilize the fish out of water trope by putting a narrow and specific focus on white teachers being thrown into this mostly black world. The hook for audiences being, what is such a straight-laced person doing in such a wild environment? Literally, the original trailer for Up the Down Staircase asks this of its white protagonist entering a multiracial school zone.
Hey, just a minute. What is a nice girl like you doing in a crazy place like this?
And that question partly answers why we see so many of these stories and why it's usually a white teacher being thrust into a mostly black and brown school. These schools are, on screen, treated like they're the dark underworlds of chaos and fear. Hollywood loves the savior trope because it's partly a fish out of water trope, and they love using the fish out of water trope alongside race and class because the dichotomy is fascinating and makes for good storytelling. But rarely do these films observe that dichotomy in a way that captures all the gray areas and all the nuances of what it means to be positioned above a group of people in not only authority but in class and society. In these movies, a white teacher enters an unruly school full of students who are not only badly behaved, but who can barely read or write, or have a poor understanding of basic arithmetic. Rarely do these stories consider the situations that have put these students into such a state. The correlation between illiteracy and poverty, or the low state funding that can result in schools having outdated textbooks, understaffed buildings, and underpaid teachers. They have no problem depicting these students not wanting to go to school or even skipping school altogether, but rarely do they go into the why, because oftentimes, and especially in communities with low school funding, students don't want to go to school because they can see from the dilapidated buildings and the old textbooks and the uninspired teachers that no one really cares if they get an education or not, so why bother? These movies scarcely look at all the ways in which the education system as a whole is pretty flawed, and it rarely acknowledges the work of any teacher outside of the main character. Two great and infamous examples are Dangerous Minds and Freedom Writers. In Dangerous Minds, the fictional counterpart of Luann Johnson is framed as being the only teacher who cares about her students and wants them to succeed. The school is marred in graffiti and litter. The students are so badly behaved that Luann has to resort to karate lessons to get them to be quiet for 5 fucking seconds, and the entire faculty has essentially given up on these kids. But the movie adaptation is so vastly different from reality that even knowing Hollywood is behind it, it gets a little laughable. Teachers who worked at Carlmont High, the school depicted in the movie, have made it a point over the years to clarify that the school they taught at was not the school depicted in the final cut. It should also be noted that Dangerous Minds was based on the cringily titled memoir, My Posse Don't Do Homework. But I don't blame Johnson for the film adaptation because, as she learned after seeing the movie post-release in 1995, Hollywood lies are akin to wildfires. Once they get started, it ravishes everything in sight until you can't recognize what was there before. And even she took issue with some of the liberties taken by the filmmakers. For instance, the producers were really pushing to include a subplot where Johnson was suspended from the school for having a relationship with her student. Bewildered, Johnson, of course, told them that they couldn't do that. They insisted that it would add a bit of sexiness to the story. Even more bewildered, Johnson was like, "Bro, I'm a teacher. You can't say I did something like that because people will think that I did it. I could lose my job. That is illegal." And they were like, "Ugh, fine. Party pooper doesn't want to fuck her student, how disappointing." But the liberties didn't stop there. Wade Dominguez's character is murdered toward the end of the movie despite the fact that no student of Johnson's during her time at Carlmont High School was killed. And she never faced so much animosity from her students and their families for being white. In the movie, the grandmother of 2 of her students pulls her grandson out of school, and when Johnson goes to see what's going on, the grandmother says this.
"Hi, I'm Luann Johnson. I'm the boys' teacher."
"I know who you are. You that white bread bitch messing with my baby's mind."
To that, Johnson was quick to dispute. It was really insulting. Most of these black grandmothers are church-going women, and it taps into a misconception that black parents are going to be antagonistic toward white people, which wasn't my experience. Many of these teacher-savior movies aren't about critiquing the education system. In fact, I'd say most of them aren't remotely concerned about critiquing the education system. But what they all have in common is an overvaluing of trauma porn and poverty porn. Teachers employed at Carlmont High School were clear to say that the school wasn't nearly as bad as it was shown to be in Dangerous Minds. No student of Johnson's was murdered just off campus despite her best efforts to protect him. In fact, the real-life person Dominguez's character was based on went on to join the Marine Corps, and in the case of Freedom Writers, the 2007 film based on the 1999 book, it's really not that much different. Critics of the film adaptation have pointed out how different the Long Beach school looked on screen than how it actually looked in 1993 to 1998, the time period in which the story takes place. They've also pointed out that Aaron Gruelle, the teacher at the center of the story, also taught middle-class white students, and that many teachers at the school assisted her in achieving her goals with her class. Judging from the film, you'd think that no teacher had ever tried this. Worse, you'd guess that apart from the noble Gruelle, no other teacher cares. Gruelle's work is noteworthy, but it is by no means unusual. Racism is another thing these movies want to focus on, but in the same way that these movies do all the time, which is to put racism off as being something that only the worst of individuals do and that has nothing to do with a system of disadvantage. In Freedom Writers, Gruelle is confronted by a fellow teacher who is almost cartoonishly racist. This character is the worst of the worst, but that's as far as the film goes in its portrayal of implicit bias and discrimination in the school environment. These films usually have a fixation on highlighting race, specifically the animosity black students feel for their nice white lady teachers and the odd cartoonish racist, but they all lack the self-awareness, it seems, to realize they're leaning a little heavily into a white savior narrative. During the filming of Dangerous Minds, actress Brooklyn Harris asked Luann Johnson why it was that stories like these always centered on white people uplifting the quote, poor little Negroes, and Johnson simply said, I wrote the book. I have to be white. But Harris's question was valid. I don't think she was asking Luann Johnson why she wrote a story about a white teacher uplifting black students. I'm pretty sure she knew it was a memoir. Having seen a lot of these movies come and go, I can't help but notice that there's always a consistency in what movies are selected to be adapted into films, and that there are a disproportionate amount of adaptations based on the writings of white teachers in inner city schools. There are teachers of color who not only teach in these communities, but live in these communities, who make a difference for their students every day, but those aren't the stories that get told. You would think, based on the makeup of these movies, that there were very few black educators who made a difference in their classrooms, and that there weren't any who wrote books about those experiences. But what of the teachers who live in those neighborhoods and teach at those schools? What of the stories of the teachers who have always been there?
In case you haven't noticed, Mrs. Collins, we are in a ghetto. These children don't want to learn.
The ghetto is not the enemy, Miss Denny.
I suppose you mean we are.
Indifference is.
I feel sometimes like a person to whom in childhood was entrusted some sacred flame. This is the desire to see my race lifted out of the mire of ignorance, weakness, and degradation, no longer to sit in obscure corners and devour the scraps of knowledge which his superiors flung at him. I want to see him crowned with strength and dignity, adorned with the enduring grace of intellectual attainments. On May 17, 1954, after years of the civil rights movement and efforts of black school teachers across the country, the Supreme Court ruled for desegregating all schools, citing segregation as unconstitutional. Black kids were bused to schools that were now integrated, facing a lot of animosity and violence from white parents and students who did not want them there. The Little Rock Nine was not that long ago.
The kids show up to school on September 4th, 1957, the first day of school. The senior in the group of the Little Rock Nine is Ernest Green, and he is like, oh my gosh, there is an assload of angry white people.
Black schools and institutions were slowly but surely shuttered, and countless black teachers and principals were either demoted to driving buses, becoming lunch ladies and school janitors, or they were fired and had to find, after years of being an educator, another form of work. Today, people lament the scarcity of black teachers in the education system, but few acknowledge the ways in which black educators were shut out of education almost as soon as segregation ended. Black students already had a difficult time being accepted into white schools. Black teachers going into white schools and teaching white kids also didn't sit well with white teachers or white parents. Even after the negative effects of integration, with black students being placed in often hostile environments and black teachers being fired, black teachers still tried to advocate for the changes they initially envisioned when pushing for integration. But under the positive white noise of Brown versus Board of Education, no one would hear them out. The way Dangerous Minds and Freedom Writers and the plethora of other films focused on the white savior teacher narrative are so fixated on race, you'd think more opportunities would be taken to highlight the stories of the few black teachers that were integrated into white schools, or the resistance black students faced from white teachers just after integration. But when these stories from black teachers were told, they were also swiftly dismissed. And here is where we have got to talk about Beryl Gilroy. Gilroy, the first black head teacher in Britain. After teaching in Guyana from the late 40s up until the 50s, she moved to London and looked for work as a teacher there. At the time, though, there was so much hostility towards black folks that she struggled to get a job, and when she did eventually get one in the late 60s, she faced a riot of racist abuse from not only fellow teachers and parents, but from her very own students.
When I came out, Sue eyed me with a look of prurient curiosity. "Not being rude," she said, "just being inquisitive. What do natives do when they go to bed?" I asked. "You know," she said, self-consciously gesturing, "your monthlies." "You mean when we menstruate?" I asked. She nodded. "Well, Sue," I replied with mock seriousness, "we swim. We jump into the nearest river and swim for miles. Some of us swim for 3 days and some for 4. But that's what we do."
In 1976, Gilroy published a book aptly titled Black Teacher, which detailed her experience being a fish out of water, teaching in a mostly white school, where the students often discounted her because of her race. And do you know how the public responded? Do you want to guess? Do you think they made a film adaptation of her work? Do you think that, like Up the Down Staircase, it became a bestseller? Well, spoiler alert, honey. A lot of people were really mad. Many critics put the book down as being unrealistic. They insisted that Gilroy's experience of racism in London schools wasn't actually racism at all, and that she was even making some of it up. Some went as far as to say it wasn't that hard for her to get a job as a teacher, and that whatever racism she thought she experienced couldn't have been that bad because she got to be a teacher anyway. In Beryl Gilroy's telling of experiencing racism, of being put in this new world where so much hatred was hurled at her, critics question whether they needed to hear about it again. I get it, they seem to say. Racism was bad and immigrants were treated awfully, but we're fine now, so do I really need to hear about it again? Get over it. Whereas with teachers like Luann Johnson, the filmmakers adapting her story were obsessed with centralizing her experience being deplored by students and parents for her race, even though those were not her experiences. In one scene, Johnson is branded a white bread bitch by an enraged grandparent of African American twins who have dropped out of class. Johnson tells me that this never happened. I asked them, where did that come from? They said, we were sure that some of the black and the Hispanic parents must have resented you. I said, for what? For helping their kids? Hell, nobody ever said anything to me like that. If these stories were really about highlighting the work of teachers or highlighting racism, stories like Gilroy's wouldn't be so easily dismissed, while stories like Up the Down Staircase by Belle Kaufman would become acclaimed bestsellers and spawn film adaptations. And it's not quite just a case of wanting white stories over black stories, because we get quite a few stories about black male teachers and coaches saving their students, many of which are also based on true stories. The George McKenna story, Remember the Titans, which is very interesting about race, The Great Debate, get out of here Denzel, God, Coach Carter, Pride, and the father of all, To Sir with Love. It's also important to make the distinction that although To Sir with Love was the story of a black teacher teaching in a multiracial, but mostly white, British school and not being able to control the children, he didn't really centralize his experiences with racial discrimination in such a way that white readers became uncomfortable, which probably explains why Beryl Gilroy, writing not just about teaching and becoming headmaster, but about the resistance she faced to get to that point, was met with backlash at the time. People were much more comfortable not being reminded about the existence of the racism she had to live through every day. Cinema has always been more comfortable with having black male leads than with having black female leads. So movies about white male educators or white female educators or black male educators have often taken precedence over movies about black female educators, which are so rare that despite so many black women in education, there are only 2 movies based on their stories. In 1981, the Marvin Collins movie was produced for TV, starring the great Cicely Tyson. This made-for-TV movie is a great deal better than I think a lot of people would expect, but of course, it is Cicely Tyson, so Marvin Collins was a Chicago-based educator who started her own private school called Westside Prep Elementary after feeling disappointed by the education system and noting how it seemed to be failing a lot of students. She was disillusioned by the faculty of the public school she had been teaching at and took $5,000 to buy a space in West Garfield Park, her own neighborhood, to give students the education she thought they deserved. She taught the children the expected essentials, but also went as far as to teach the Socratic method, Shakespeare, and other classic classic literature. Before making this decision, she worked as a substitute teacher throughout inner cities in Chicago, which she did for over 14 years. Here was a teacher who saw how schools were failing students, particularly low-income students, and not only adjusted her method of teaching, but decided to open a private school on her own dime. Westside Prep Elementary took tuition, but for the students who couldn't afford it, school was often free. It was important to Collins that the black children being abandoned by the education system would find their footing and not be dismissed or mislabeled before they had a chance to learn.
I will be superior in my ability.
I will be superior in my ability.
In my thoughts.
In my thoughts.
In my deeds.
In my deeds.
And in my actions.
And in my actions.
And you must speak.
So, who is the most important child in this world?
I am.
And what is the most important time?
No.
Now. And I don't want you to waste either one of them.
The movie brought Marvin Collins a lot more recognition, and with admirers came hordes of detractors. Her most famous anti-fan was George N. Schmidt, who insisted time and time again that Collins was lying and that her students couldn't possibly be capable of what she said they were capable of, that these students were unteachable, and any progress Collins claimed to have made with them was entirely fabricated. But these stories, The Bright Roads and the Marvin Collins movies, aren't the norm. The two movies were released nearly 30 years apart from each other, and now it's been over 40 years since the Marvin Collins movie, and stories about black women in education are still pretty rare. The stories that are so often selected to be highlighted are about the experiences of white teachers, with the suggestion being that good teaching is only exceptional when it's white teachers undertaking the task, and even then only when their teaching is directed towards students of color. Because they're so damn unteachable, these damn kids. Damn. So when we go back and look at the question of race in these movies and how it's presented, it becomes clear that the movies in their aim to dismantle racism isn't that at all. It's instead a depiction of nice white people with the intent of upholding the idea of a post-racial society. Many of these movies are often more concerned with showing the experiences of white teachers, having them experience a bit of pushback for being white, and giving them a taste of racism by having them talk to a racist individual who is one bad apple. When they take shape, these films suggest a civic duty for white people. It is their duty to help the ignorant black folks in their lives. It is their duty to save them from themselves. It is their burden.
I have some wonderful news for you.
What?
Nina, you're fired.
What?
Fly like a bird!
Oh, you have finally lost it.
Harsh medicine, I know, but it's what you need.
This job is what I need. This job pays for my health insurance, and I get to take free classes.
Nina, sweetheart, trust me, I know what's best for you.
You don't know what's best for me. You don't even know me. You think I'm some little helpless black girl who can't make it in the world without the help of some enlightened white guy showing her the way.
And you say I don't know you.
In 1898, the Spanish-American War came to an end when the US and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris. The treaty put an end to the war, with Spain ceding sovereignty of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Since Magellan discovered the Philippines, claim of the country was staked by the Spanish Empire, the occupation lasting for over 300 years. During the Spanish-American War, an agreement, basically a purchase, made between Spain and the US led to the Spanish occupation slowly ending while the American occupation was just beginning. But it wasn't going to be that simple. After a few centuries of occupation, the Filipino people wanted independence, and a month after the Treaty of Paris, revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo established the First Philippine Republic in Mawdsley, Bulacan. This conflict incited the Philippine-American War, an event of mass brutality and atrocities. You had one side fighting for the freedom they'd been barred from for over 300 years, and the other side fighting against that freedom for freedom and insisting that they were indeed only fighting for the freedom of the other side. This justification, the idea that the US government and its army were only doing what was best for the savage Filipinos, is what gave us benevolent assimilation. The policy that insisted that the goal of the war was not to decimate the Filipinos, but to save them from something that they didn't really need saving from. Emilio Aguinaldo, during the Spanish-American War, actually led the Filipino army to recapturing many parts of the Philippines. So I kind of think, they were fine. The goal of this assimilation was to save Filipino people from their uncivil ways, and this was done through the atrocities of war and also through education during the US occupation. The Thomasites had the duty of teaching the Filipino youth civility, the duty of instructing them to embrace instead the American way. The guerrilla war that ensued and the understandable resistance of the Philippines was what inspired the one and only Rudyard Kipling to make what is, without a doubt, his most famous piece of writing, White Man's Burden.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness unfluttered folk and wild, your new court's sullen peoples half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, the toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humour slowly toward the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. But all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent sullen people shall wear your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise, comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold-edged with dear-brought wisdom, the judgment of your peers.
This poem is like the anthem of the white savior. It implores its readers to dismiss and discredit whatever the people they're trying to save have to say, strip them of their agency, of their identity, continue to drag them to your definition of civilization, no matter how much they kick and scream and beg you not to. No matter how much damage you're actually doing, you can hide behind the excuse that you are nobly carrying these people away from barbarism and into refinement. This philosophy was also the key factor in the development of the Civilization Fund Act, an act pushing for the re-education of Native Americans with the aim to civilize them benevolently. As a result, a bunch of boarding schools catered to Native American children were opened throughout the United States and Canada. They operated from the late 1800s all the way up until the 1960s, and they were awful. Children were taken to these schools against their will, against the will of their families, stripped of their identities, punished if they spoke their language, abused, and many were killed. Historians are still in the process of uncovering numerous mass graves from these institutions and are still investigating the extent of the depravities and the inhumanity that these children were subjected to. I will not pretend to be an expert on this. I'm still learning and still reading as more information comes along. But what I will do is direct you to articles and books that have helped me out, and just generally toward people who can tell you more or who know more about the topic than I do. I bring up this history, the burden as it pertains to this white supremacist thinking, to give a better idea as to why and how these subgenres can be so inherently questionable or inherently problematic. They are more than just inspirational teacher movies about uplifting students and doing the right thing. They are about more than supporting a confounded youth desperately searching for meaning. Because the framing of these stories echoes these sentiments from the 1800s, the idea that these kids are lost and that the only way they can be found is through the nobility of a brave or nice white person. And it's tricky, because Dangerous Minds and Freedom Writers and that one with Matthew Perry and that Lifetime one and that other Lifetime one are all based on true stories. So what do I want? What is the point? Do I want white teachers to just not be helpful to their black students? Do I want white teachers to not teach at predominantly black schools? No. What I do want is for teachers, white or not, to avoid going into these schools with this insidious savior mindset. In For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too, Reality Pedagogy and Urban Education, Christopher Emdin wrote about his first day teaching at an inner city school and how he and a fellow teacher were both projecting onto new freshmen this idea they had of them, an idea that came from media, from the news decrying how awful these schools and these students were, and possibly for other teachers, from movies they watched so they could learn how to teach. They were already looking at these kids as if they were troublemakers, when in reality they were just nervous 14-year-old kids wearing their nicest clothes on the first day of school. Though our motivations and experiences were different, in the course of our conversations, we learned we had one thing in common: to see urban youth of color as a group that is potentially dangerous and needs to be saved from themselves. For all teachers, regardless of race, going into teaching with a savior mindset leaves students at a disadvantage. Implicit bias seeps into the minds of the educators, which then affects how their pupils see themselves and even how or if they're going to learn. When teachers approach teaching with themselves in focus, with the idea that they and only they are going to fix or save a student, they place themselves on a high ground where they have value and their students, without their aid, don't. The belief that students are in need of cleaning up presumes that they are dirty. Second, the aim of giving them a better life indicates that their present life has little or no value. Saviorism has no place in education. Saviorism has no place in, well, anything. And because I know someone's gonna be like, so what, now you don't want teachers to help their students if they're white? Again, that's not the point, honey. The point is the mentality. Are you going in with the mentality that without you, precious old you, these kids would have no other opportunities? Are you going in to pat yourself on the back about how you could be teaching at a fancy private school, but you're teaching in the inner city? Are you looking at your students like they're people or like they're projects that need cleaning up? Are you looking at them and just seeing criminals? Are you projecting ideas onto them without actually knowing them? Are you a Miss Morello? Beyond that, the fact is, teaching is fucking hard. If not for the students, then for the administration. If not for the administration, then for the parents. If not for the parents, then for the entire education system as a whole. It's a tough and thankless industry, and it's no wonder so many teachers decide to just call it quits. And unsuspecting, well-intended would-be teachers don't need to be lured in by the barrage of perspiration, because not only do they burn themselves out and become so stressed that it affects their health, but when they start to lose the passion, when they inevitably start to lose interest, students who want to learn can feel that, and maybe even they start to wonder, what's the point?
We all come in every morning eager to learn, but most of the teachers just seem completely uninterested in education. One of my teachers, Miss Manley, has been particularly hard to work with. She was quiet at first, but she showed some potential. I thought maybe she just needed a little time to come out of her shell, but as the weeks went by, she just sat there listlessly at her desk, never talking or participating.
Going into teaching with a savior mentality or with a preconceived notion on how it will be based on movies or adverts like these don't just impact the students and how they learn, it impacts the teachers. Teachers deserve to know what they're getting into, especially lately. The teaching world has not had a moment to reevaluate schooling since the pandemic, and a lot of teachers are burnt out. But even before the pandemic, new teachers often became overwhelmed at how different teaching was from their expectations, from what they had been told it would be like. I have fun trying to estimate how much money programs like Teach for America have spent on advertising alone. They make teaching sound like it's going to be an amazing experience. But once teachers are in these environments, even when they love their students, many of them quickly learn that this was not everything they thought it would be. It's one thing to have a tough student, but it's another thing to feel like your higher ups don't give a shit about you, your classroom, or your health. There's this fantastic video from Honest Teacher Vibes where she breaks down her experiences with teaching and her irresponsible administration and how it all led to her eventually leaving the teaching profession for good. And in recent times, this departure has only accelerated. I think being a teacher is one of the hardest jobs in the world. Teaching the students and preparing them for the world beyond school is difficult. Add to that demeaning parents who think that you're just a babysitter, low income, and an education system that's more fixated on test scores than actual learning. It's an often thankless job, and there's no wonder so many teachers, even teachers who have been at this for decades, are ready to move on. I guess something that would be semi-accurate to that struggle, like that experience, would be the movie 187. If you've never heard of that movie, I'm about to rock your world, maybe. Samuel L. Jackson is this teacher in an inner city school in like New York or Chicago or whatever. He has this student who has scribbled 187 in all of his textbooks, which I think is the police code for homicide. This student apparently has a bone to pick with him, and then we see the student, and it's Method Man, and Method Man stabs Samuel L. Jackson, and Samuel L. Jackson is almost like he's almost dead. Then a year later, he's at a different school in California as a substitute teacher, and this school is also really bad, and Clifton Collins Jr. is like the spawn of Satan or something. He's a student that cannot be saved, not because he's a bad student, he's just like an evil person. Someone gets gunned down right in front of him, and he's like, alright, let's go get a slushie. I don't think he says that exactly, but that's the vibe. And things escalate between them. Clifton Collins Jr. steals Samuel L. Jackson's watch. He gets away with it because the principal doesn't give a shit. And then Clifton Collins Jr. keeps trying to kill Samuel L. Jackson, and Samuel L. Jackson's like, I'm trying to teach you! Why won't you let me teach you? And then they're dead. So, I know a lot of teachers who can relate to that, actually. I had a lot of problems in high school. I have a lot of problems now. And if not for some of the teachers I had, I'm not even sure I would be where I am today or who I am today. Because I had teachers who treated me with respect. They didn't approach me or my situation like I had to be rescued. They saw me as an individual with my own opinions, my own view of the world, and they encouraged me to be my best self without discouraging me. They weren't on a mission to save anyone. They were on a mission to impart whatever wisdom they had to share, and maybe that wisdom would, in turn, be used to help their young students come into their own. And that's what students need. They need teachers who are supportive, patient, and willing to meet them at their level, not people who see them as rare specimens to observe, nor as things that will elevate them somehow, either in status or morality. And teachers need a real system of support. They shouldn't have to go into their own pockets to get school supplies. Parents shouldn't be treating them like shit over the smallest things. And they should be paid enough to make a living without feeling like they're living on breadcrumbs. They should not be ignored by their administration when they ask for help. A lot of these movies are fun to watch, and they can be a nice pick-me-up, but some of them have deep-rooted issues that go beyond a flimsy story. Their influence on those who watch them is significant, and it's not just inspiration they're selling, it's preconceived notions, it's stereotypes, it's implicit bias. I guess there's no harm in enjoying them for what they are, but as always, be healthily critical of the art you consume. So that is it. That is the white teacher savior video that I promised 2 years ago. I have a lot of people that I need to thank for their contributions to this video. I have to thank Luke, who read the white man's burden poem for me. Did not think he would say yes, but he did, and that's amazing. I have to thank Akua, otherwise known as Town of Tawiah, who narrated some of the excerpts from Beryl Gilroy's, is it a memoir? I think it's a memoir from Beryl Gilroy's memoir. Thank you guys so much. Thank you all for watching, and now we go to the thank you for the patrons. MUBI is a curated streaming service, a place to watch beautiful, interesting, and incredible cinema. Every day, MUBI premieres a new film, from iconic directors to emerging auteurs. There is always something new to discover. With MUBI, each and every film is hand-selected. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. I was really excited to see that MUBI had a new Hirokazu Koreeda double feature. 2 of his films, I Wish and The Third Murder, are now available for streaming on MUBI, and I couldn't recommend either of them more. Koreeda's films are consistently thoughtful, well-made, and empathetic. Whether he's exploring the afterlife, the ins and outs of the nuclear family, or shoplifters, he never fails to capture the emotional highs and lows of simply being. The film I especially want to highlight today is I Wish. Following 2 siblings separated after their parents' divorce, I Wish is a heartening portrayal of the modern family. It's complex, as all of Koreeda's films are, but what makes it astounding is the simplicity he approaches these themes with. Some directors might buckle under the weight of something so refined, but Koreeda finds comfort in nuance and empathy. His characters, I promise, will stay with you long after the movie's over. You can try MUBI free for 30 days at mubi.com/Yarzade. That is mubi.com/Yarzade for a whole month of great cinema for free. And if you haven't seen I Wish, please check it out. You will not regret it.
I would like to teach you something. I would like to be Michelle Pfeiffer to your angry black kid who learns that poetry is just another way to rap.